Jeremy and I, we thought we could just introduce ourselves. So a little bit more about me for those who don't know me. I am, as I said, the president of the PCNV now, I work for the Uniting Church in Australia in the Synod of Victoria and Tasmania, doing some interesting work with schools and community service groups and in chaplaincy related work. And I'll no doubt refer to that as we go through our conversation piece this afternoon. I'm married to Heather, and we have two children, Nicholas and Natasha, who are just a wonder to me every day in terms of the things that they bring into Heather's and my life, the enjoyment and the thoughts that they provoke in us and the conversations that we have. I'm really keen on gardening and cooking. I love engaging in various environmental causes, including thinking about how that matters in our home and what we can do on the home front to sustain the planet and make it that abundant place, retain it as that abundant place that the Wurundjeri people here knew as they were going up and down the river. So that'll do for me. I'll just spotlight Jeremy here, and the way I'll ask Jeremy to introduce himself, then we'll start having a look at these questions that are in front of us. We'll have a chat for 30 to 40 minutes, so somewhere around that 4:45 time, one of us will remind each other that we might finish up with the questions, and then we'll do those notices and introduce the breakout group. So let me add Jeremy as a spotlight and allow him to unmute himself. There we are, Jeremy. You should be asked to unmute. Welcome, Jeremy. And over to you, really, to do a bit of an introduction, and then we'll get started in our conversation.
Yeah, terrific. Thank you so much, Adrian, and really good to see some familiar faces amongst those gathered. So it's a delight for me to be here this afternoon. I'm here on the lands of the Turrbal and Yagara people in Brisbane, just not far from the Brisbane River, and looking from my window at St John's Cathedral in Brisbane. So if you know Brisbane, one of the delights of sitting in my office is I get to look out at the cathedral. A bit of an introduction to me. I grew up in Adelaide, a cradle Anglican, one of those children in a family that filled a whole pew in the church where we attended as I was growing up, and I'll talk a bit more about that later on. So I grew up in the church, and after a few bumpy years was ordained an Anglican priest, worked a bit in Adelaide, and then headed bush and worked in Ceduna on the far west coast of South Australia, then Katherine in the Northern Territory, then Darwin, and then the Sunshine Coast. Mum hopes I'll keep moving clockwise and end up back in Adelaide, but I've kind of got stuck here because last year I was elected Archbishop of Brisbane, and so I'm probably here for at least the next 10 years, depending on how things go, but we'll see. When I was made bishop about 6 or 7 years ago, a couple of the other bishops in the Australian Church wrote to the primate, so that's the kind of elected archbishop, head of the Anglican Church in Australia, wrote to the primate objecting to my consecration because they didn't think I was a real Christian. When I was elected as Archbishop, I'm sure their heads were spinning, but instead they just wrote nice letters to me assuring me of their prayers and hoping that I could keep my ordination vows. So it's a very strange space I find myself in. I'm married to Josie. We have 3 wonderful adult children who have a fantastically healthy ambivalence towards the church. They have a deep sense of social justice and a depth of spirituality that I'm in awe of, but actually they could leave the church and they're a bit bewildered by why I want anything to do with it. Um, I'm kept grounded by them and by a mad border collie with whom I walk along the Brisbane River most mornings to give myself a sense of peace amongst the madness of it all. So really looking forward to a conversation with Adrian, who I've known for a number of years, and it's been great to reconnect and be here this afternoon. So thank you.
Thanks, Jeremy. As I said, we kind of threw some questions, or I threw a few questions together, and we had a bit of a chat about them, and we thought they might be a useful way to kind of to kick this off. And what we'll do is I or you, Jeremy, can kind of name them as they go down the list as it makes sense. We'll probably answer some of them by virtue of the conversation that we have as we go along, before we actually get to them and so on. So we'll see how it goes. But the first one we thought we'd have a look at is sort of taking the topic back to its to the academic level of that notion of religion and changing our mind about religion. Is that question of how we describe religion and what it is or it's not, and what's our working definition become. What did you think of that, Jeremy, when you were hit with that question?
One of the sort of more academic definitions that resonates with me more and more is religion being about a human response to the conflict of finitude. Yeah, it's great language, but it's really about how do I make sense of the fact that stuff comes to an end, even when I don't want them to. And we kind of live in that tension between wanting some stuff to go on forever, but knowing that things come to an end. Richard Holloway, a number of years ago, said it. He said, we just need to remember that everything is provisional, except God. And, all the doctrines, all the dogmas, the buildings, all the stuff that we've created is provisional, except for God. And making sense of that, I guess, is at the heart of what religion, for me, is about. Where do you land in that place?
I look at the last meeting when Alex Sangster was speaking, she used that very traditional definition or etymology of the word, the re and the ligated, the rebinding, the connecting together again. And I've noticed that there are a number of ways that the word can be pulled, religion can be pulled apart and so on. But I have to say that very basic definition that she used last week that wasn't by any means the first time I'd heard that, and I've grappled with that a lot. And what it does for me when you think of that notion of to bind or connect or reconnect is, it makes me think a lot about our tendency to create to create things. You mentioned them there in your answer about, to create structures and dogmas and so on, and to kind of hold very tightly to them as if they aren't transient, and through that potentially lose connection with others. And what does it mean to kind of use the experience of religion not to hold on and to separate, but to reconnect and find a new way back to each other? I also find that tends to kind of open up the possibilities for me of what practices and what is religion for me, and my religious experience can extend way beyond the things of the church and so on. I have a passion and a real interest in community development, for example, and that's a reconnecting art. So there's a lot in that kind of speaks to me about there's a religious experience in that, even when it's not done in the way or the place where people would normally think of religion. So yeah.
I think in that place, it becomes less and less an intellectual exercise, and more, you use the language, you talked about experience and practice, but it is that it becomes more something from the heart, less about what's going on in the head. And for me, that's where I find life. I think, my spiritual director said to me not long ago, I believe less and less but my faith is deeper and deeper. He said, I don't know that I believe anything much anymore, except I know that I'm not God. And I think it's in that place, where we have to sort of lean into experience and the practices that have been passed on through the tradition and other practices. And those are the places where we can begin to find, that reconnection with ourselves, with community, with the sacred.
When you talked there about believing less and less and so on, it's a good segue into the next question, really, which was around in unpacking this notion of changing our mind about religion. What would you offer as our original or formative religious experiences? You named a little bit of what was happening there for you in your intro. What's that? Tell us a bit about the journey.
As I said, growing up in the church, it was a given, and grew up in this family, and I have this strange family tree that if you shake it, there's bishops and clergy who fall out everywhere. And so there was a whole lot of stuff that was just given about the church and the faith. And so that fairly typical, I think, for a number of us, journey through Sunday school and that sort of very clear, black and white, childlike understanding of what God might be about and what the Bible stories were about. Mm. I had the gift of going to a Catholic school with a couple of, and there were a couple of mad nuns still on the staff who were terrific because they actually encouraged questions. And it was that space where I began to have some more thoughtful conversations about this thing that I'd inherited. And some cracks started to appear, even at that very early age, in that pretty solid edifice that had been built for me by grandparents and parents and a church growing up. So that was the first sense I had that actually it was okay to question some of these things. And I remember Sister Pat Macaulay, a crazy Irish woman who was our PE teacher, who absolutely encouraged questions about, particularly about Bible stories. So that for me was the beginnings of a shift, but also out of that pretty traditional place of beginning.
There are some beautiful stories. Yours is not the first time I've heard that story, Jeremy, of beautiful stories of people deep within the Catholic tradition kind of offering this chance of a chance to question, really. And that's I think for me, the entry point. So being part of the Uniting Church for all of my life, and there's branches of Congregationalism and Methodism, two of the kind of uniting churches in my background, and was part of a Methodist church, which fairly soon after I was born, or by the time I was 6, changed to a Uniting Church. So similarly, kind of the family was involved in that church and had been for a long time, and there were branches of the family involved in church all over the place. And like you, the Sunday school experience, all of those kinds of things. Not a lot of people in leadership roles in my family, like yours necessarily, a few, but really just pew sitters all over the place. But I've written about this a number of times, so some may have heard this story a number of times, but I was always fascinated about how I was a very diligent student in the school environment, but I couldn't seem to make myself a diligent student in the kind of in the Sunday school and church kind of context. There was a lot about it that fairly early on didn't seem to make sense to me, and I'm only reflecting on that now back through that lens of history. I don't think I knew that I was asking those questions at the time. It was just that the things I was learning in the school environment seemed very important, and the things that I was learning about didn't seem so important in a strange sort of way. But I've equally written about how the fact that I find that a shame now as I look back on it, because what I've learned about a lot of those things, the kind of the the broader interpretation of them, the questions that can be asked about them, as you said, that didn't seem to be an available option how you explored them. So my, unfortunately, my reaction was to a bit to the, well, this is a bit of a joke kind of thing, and that was fun at the time, but I really have this kind of lament now about that was it would have been a different path. Anyway, so that's looking back, that's the first time I noticed that kind of my reaction to the religious kind of dogma and so on that was shared with me. Yeah.
When you look back on that really early stuff, are there positives from there, there things from their experiences that are really significant and important that you can kind of look back at and see as formational and significant in that way?
Well, maybe that's why I'm thinking about the fact that maybe that's where there's that lament, and maybe there doesn't have to be that lament, because interestingly, a lot of people around me aren't still around the church, don't necessarily, who are part of that, don't necessarily have this interest in building community and connection and so on. And yet I did see that happening around me. So it's almost back to where we started the conversation. It's that notion of the heart stuff, the stuff about connection and about people finding a place to kind of feel connected and know they're part of something, that I noticed going on around me there, that didn't leave me. The some of what I was hearing academically, was jarring on the mind, but the experience of people caring and sharing was evidence. I think that's the thing that's most obvious to me there. Yeah.
I think for me, one of the significant shifts was, growing up, even though I started to have some questions, there was that sense that it was all about the feelings, feelings of community, of acceptance, of welcome. This was a good place. And a really significant change of mind about all of that started to come when I was a teenager preparing for confirmation, when suddenly it was all about some knowledge stuff, and here's some stuff you had to learn, rather than what I was experiencing. And that for me created this dissonance where the stuff that I was being asked to learn, some of it was just unbelievable as a teenager. I couldn't accept some of the propositions. And some of it as well started to, I think, show for me in the church a sort of hypocrisy or, a lack of authenticity. And so that's really where the sort of fractures began, I think.
And then concentrating on the start of those fractures, we thought it would be useful for the audience to reflect on what other major fissures then kind of occurred after that. So are there a couple that you could kind of think about? That was clearly a significant kind of shift for you. Anything else that kind of stands out amongst, I'm sure, many situations that would have changed your mind, that kind of shifted your practice and your understanding and stuff?
I think two different things. One was beginning to think more carefully about the language we used, particularly about God, and struggling with some of that. But then also seeing the way that, despite my experience growing up of a church being a caring, loving community, starting to see that wasn't so for everyone. And significantly, when my sister came out as gay,
mm,
the way that the church treated her differently and the way she felt in that space. Um, Again, it was one of those significant moments where I thought, actually, this isn't what I've been sold, for all those years. And I remember terrific fights with my parents around, as a sort of 14, 15-year-old, and, stopped having anything to do with the church because those things were just so problematic for me.
mm, 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 mm.
How about for you, Adrian? What were those moments?
Well, a couple of things that I jotted down on that question was that I moved around. I did some. I was before I worked for the church. I worked in corporate consultancy and IT, and I did some of that work overseas and in various places. And as part of that move around, I was born and brought up. Those experiences I spoke about earlier were in Queensland, and I moved eventually to Melbourne as part of that. And when I got here, I went looking for a congregation after a number of years because of that movement of not being involved in it. And there's probably more congregations in and around parts of Melbourne and Victoria that are at least exploring what has come to be known as the progressive Christian kind of space. So I just happened upon one of those quite by accident as I kind of walked around thinking, well, would I reconnect with the church? Could that be important to me? So there's the experience of actually having some of that language change and some of that permission to explore at the mind level, connecting with what I was seeing in terms of the compassion and the connection within that community. So that was very significant for me to kind of see a faith community grappling with how to try and live that experience, have their lived experience matching what was being named and spoken about and so on. And not long after joining that, the other big one for me was that the terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center occurred, and what I noticed about that had an effect of different types of effects on a large range of people. I realized that, but what I noticed about myself was that there were gaps and inconsistencies in my own sets of belief structures, which there'll always be, but it just brought some of those to the fore. So there were conservative viewpoints. There was perhaps unprocessed things from my childhood about who and family situation about who belonged and who didn't belong. The extreme nature of that terror attack and the fact that it demonstrated the the way that the West lives is not necessarily a sustainable way to be. Just crashed in on some of the things I was quarantining from what I was learning in this really active faith community, and it sort of changed it changed a lot for me then in terms of what I had to connect up and make the word and deed, as it were, kind of fit together. So yeah.
Mm.
Yeah.
I had a fairly important experience when I was so after I finished school and dropped in and out of university a couple of times, went off and travelled for a bit. And for no reason except that my sister had been there before me and thought it was a good place to hang out, I went to Thésée in France and spent, in the end, a couple of months in the Thésée community. And for me, that was an experience of being with other people, practicing the faith, where often there wasn't shared language, but we could do the practices together in a way that made sense for me, in a way that that hadn't necessarily made sense before. And there was that piece that there was a deep connection with the tradition, a tradition that was much bigger than me. And that was a place where something, I think, significantly shifted for me, because there were a whole lot of arguments, the sorts of arguments that still happen in the church, that suddenly were irrelevant. Um, Sometimes because we couldn't talk about them, but we could enter into a place of prayer or worship uh, together, yeah, tapping into something that was actually bigger or deeper than any of those sorts of arguments about doctrine or dogma or um, some of those other things. Um, so
Beautiful
that for
experiences.
me
Yeah,
was quite transformative. And
yeah,
again, it was about connecting deeply in community,
yeah, yeah.
being part of something that was bigger than myself.
Mm. I'm doing a presentation to a group of school leaders on Tuesday, and I've got the mantra, the Richard Raw mantra somewhere at the beginning of that presentation about transformed people transform people. He kind of uses that one all the time, and that's that notion of trying to build these communities where people can be transformed by the experience, but also transform in their own connections and exploring their own vulnerabilities and so on. So yeah,
Mhm.
yeah,
I think Marcus Borg said something like, "Yeah, it's experience of God, not belief in God. That's the invitation of Christianity."
mm,
Yeah, that sense that it is about how we are in that space and not necessarily um, what's going on in our intellectual space.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
We've got a couple of questions lower down in our question set. So as we wind towards the end of our time, that are around our personal practices and our ongoing connection within the church and how we sustain that, how we hold things together. I'm particularly looking there at the one on our list, Jeremy, that we marked as 7. Some of the significant changes in our personal practice that have come because of the things that we've talked about this afternoon. What did you make of that one when you saw it?
Look, I think in terms of my personal practice, um, I think for me, words have become less and less important. And one of the gifts of being part of a prayer book tradition is that you can use that in whatever way works best for you. You can let the words sort of wash over you. You can engage with each word, or you can dip in and out as you go. Uh, and uh, and for me, in my tradition, yeah, I find that a really helpful place it creates the space,
Mm,
but then I can engage in that in the way that's right for me at that particular time. I think, yeah, one of the gifts of the contemplative tradition is that creating a space underneath or around or beyond words
mm,
where we can access something of the sacred. Um, so that would be a bit of a shift for me,
mm,
despite being part of a church that has a prayer book that really shapes how we gather.
mm, mm,
Yeah. How
mm.
about for you? What does that look like?
Um, well, it's probably a little bit what it verges in the direction of what I alluded to in my introduction, in that I find myself being part of the activities of a faith group and a faith organization, and finding some enrichment in elements of those, particularly the contemplative parts. So your answer about the word, the sort of transcending the words and finding the meaning in other places is meaningful to me. I also think there's a lot that I was able to explore when coming into a permanent role within the Uniting Church, or taking around the kind of the transition from what the the practices of the faith and the words of the faith kind of mean on a day-to-day living basis. So again, the participating in a range of social justice oriented activities and other things, the cooking and sharing of meals with my family and others, and the sorts of conversations that we try to have about the nature of the world when we're doing that, the being out in the garden and the sharing that produce with others, and the contribution that makes to the environment around here and those kind of things. as I said, it's a bit like my answer to the first question about religion and my introduction to myself. That stuff all belongs now in terms of my sense of personal practice. It's not a disjointed, I have a prayer experience here, and I have a family experience here, and there's a prayerfulness to all of that in the sense of life being lived through me. I suppose that kind of interesting for me.
Mm.
Yeah.
It's a tricky thing having a sort of formal role in the church. But what are some of the things that you've had to let go, or you just can't abide, that kind of come with the package, but you think, oh, I just can't do that anymore?
Well, look, I thought a lot about this question, and my answer might be disappointing for some in that, and it relates to your answer as well about the prayer book, dipping in or not dipping in. There's quite a lot. Firstly, there's quite a lot that I can see through different eyes, and I know in the progressive Christian movement that we have very differing views across this audience and the broader audience on that as to whether things are redeemable and whether we can, even something like the cross as a symbol of the church and so on. I find it fascinating that there are multiple different views of how we can kind of interpret that. And one of the progressive Christian authors talked about the notion of that being an instrument of annihilation. Now that may or may not be, probably, most people think that doesn't sound like a particularly useful symbol to kind of have at the center of a movement. On the other hand, that notion of that annihilation is not our is not something for us to determine whether or not it will occur or not. It's not it's just not something that we can sustain. So if we try to annihilate, we will, we'll be proved wrong in our endeavors there. So that's a bit of a strange way to describe it, but it's that sense that most of the things that we kind of see around the church, I can redeem in some way. I can understand a broader meaning to them. And the gift of progressive Christianity has been that kind of broader understanding, that sense of, hey, did you realize this actually meant this way back? That's the kind of, so hopefully a bit hard to explain it through that, but hopefully that makes some sense. What about for you?
Oh, I'm a lot fussier about what I sing.
Yes.
There's stuff that people would have us sing that we'd never say.
Yeah.
And so I'm very mindful about that.
Mm.
I I struggle with the creed in worship. I think the creed is a really important document. But I think if we're going to gather, everything we do should express what we believe, rather than just inserting a dense theological
Mm.
piece in the middle of it.
Mm.
Um, but I think, like you, there are parts of the tradition that have endured for the last couple of thousand years for good reason,
Mm.
and they hold a deep wisdom, and sometimes that takes a bit of uncovering or rediscovering. Um, but I think most things we can either, um, even if it doesn't bring us uh, life or a depth of understanding, we can begin to think about why it might have done that for others previously.
Yeah.
And even if then we park it,
Yeah.
um, and I think one of the gifts of much of what's been written in the sort of progressive Christian sphere is that most people, I think, are not about throwing everything around, throwing everything out,
Mm.
but it is about rediscovering what sits behind or underneath, where there is deep wisdom
Yeah.
a lot of the time.
Yeah. And look, maybe my answer was a bit disingenuous. I'm sure there are things I can't kind of redeem, but there's just always that attempt going on in my mind. And the way you said that there was beautiful in terms of that people have found this of value or have meaning in it and so on. So what was that? That's intriguing to me, you know, to kind of explore that and see where that goes. Yeah, look, we're nearly out of time, but I I wonder whether there's anything else we might add. It's a similar question in a way, the last question that we had there on the list, but we have maintained a very active connection with the church. We've talked a little bit about this already, but why else might that have occurred for us? Is there anything else that we might kind of add there for the audience today that kind of might give them a sense of what else we elicit from it, we gain from it, we share in it, and so on.
When I was in Darwin, I was the dean of the cathedral there, and it was a pretty remarkable community. And on Sunday mornings, we had mainly Iranian asylum seekers from one of the detention centres join us. There were 2 Jewish families who joined us, and there were, you know, the regular sort of Anglicans. And so Muslims, Christians, and Jewish people coming together for whatever reason in that space. And it gave me a glimpse of, you know, this is what the church can be. You know, all that stuff about the kingdom of God, you know, what the world might be like if it was like God wanted it to be. Every now and then we get a glimpse of that. And the church at its best can be a parable for the world. And, you know, what a gift. And I look at the way, you know, the church is so polarized over so many things. And if we could work out how to live together with diversity and difference, you know, what a gift that would be for an increasingly polarized world. And so so I've had glimpses of that over, you know, my years in the church. And that's kind of what keeps me going, because I think, yeah, there is a tremendous gift, because my hunch is that that's what the gospel is about. You know, the kingdom on earth as it is in heaven, and we can do that every now and then. So that's what keeps me hanging in, I suppose.
Yeah, and I think for me, it's just really that sense of the Uniting Church is an incredible place of diversity and the richness of its connections into the social justice space and so on. I've travelled to the USA for work a number of times, particularly looking at the connection between community development and faith and so on a number of times. And there are some organisations in the US that have spawned out of the faith kind of background that have gone on to do very creative things. And I thought, oh, look, if I was in America, I might work for them. But we don't quite have that here in Australia. And the Uniting Church has been a place for me of quite, particularly in the Synod here in Victoria and Tasmania, for all of its failings, of quite creative kind of ministry and exploration of opportunities for people in the building communities. So so that's why it's the place for me at the moment, and it's feeling good in that sense. Yeah. All right. Well, it's been a delightful conversation, Jeremy. Thank you for engaging with me in it, and I hope our audience this afternoon have found something in it that resonated with their own experiences, or something that provoked a question for them.
Yeah, thanks, Adrian. It's been great fun and a delight. And I'm really happy to stick around and be plonked into a small group at some point after the notices.
Thanks, Jerry. Yes, we'll do that. Well, we are highly appreciative of you making the time in what is a diverse and complex role that you hold. So, and it was great to hear that, hear your experiences as part of the conversation. And one like a group will undoubtedly have you in their conversation round when we get to that. So, thanks very much. And if you'd like to show your appreciation of Jeremy spending time on us, then you might like to raise your hands and thank you.